The concept of a god usually denotes some form of omnipotence, at least when one considers a typical monotheistic deity. A god in that sense is invulnerable, infallible, and above all, immune to death. But in many ancient pantheons, the gods, while still powerful, did not possess mastery over mortality. They too could be offended, harmed, and even killed, and whilst they were indeed considered to be above humanity, they could still be felled by the same dangers their worshippers faced. These gods were known to even suffer alongside their worshippers, and experience the same pains of childbirth, famine, disease, and indeed death. But one Mesopotamian god in the form of Dumuzid would make something of a habit of dying, and whether his death be at the hands of his vengeful wife Inanna or at the claws of demons, Dumuzid's yearly deaths would have great ramifications for the humans. But before we get started on today's episode, a brief message from the sponsor of today's video, Pantheon. Pantheon are an exciting clothing brand that features some really cool designs from various mythologies. Whether you're into Arabian, Celtic, Greek, Norse, or even Native American mythology, Pantheon has you covered, with hundreds of t-shirts sporting all of your favourite gods, goddesses, and creatures. Each item is made from 100% cotton and is printed with brilliant original artwork, comprising of characters like Poseidon, Shiva, the Shinigami, and many more. My personal favourite is the Anubis hoodie, but not only is the printed art fantastic, and certainly a surefire way to get into the gods' good books, but it's really comfortable too. The hoodie is a great way to show off your love for Egyptian mythology, and the best part is, items are unisex, fitting both male and female. But if you can't decide on something to pick, given that there's so much choice to choose from, perhaps you might let the gods decide on your behalf, and order from Pandora's Box. Orders here will net you up to 4 random t-shirts, perfect as gifts for any mythology lover, or maybe for yourself, if you're feeling lucky. I highly recommend you check out Pantheon, over on pantheonapparel.co.uk, who do ship worldwide by the way. Use my discount code TLOH at the checkout, or use my unique code in the description box below. Right now, Pantheon are offering a 3 for 2 sale across the site, so don't delay in donning yourself in some awesome teas. And now back to Dumuzid. Commonly referred to as the god of shepherds, given his association with agriculture, or as a god of change, given his association with the seasons, Dumuzid was considered to be an important deity, despite his lack of prominence when compared to the likes of Enki, Enlil, or even his own wife, Inanna. To the Akkadians, and in later worship, Dumuzid would be known under perhaps the more popular name Tammuz, though even with this name change and the increased prominence amongst his worshippers, the actual worship that took place to this particular god is quite unique. This likely stems from the fact that Dumuzid either took over certain realms, either through a rise in popularity or social conflation, or that he was composed of several characters or figures from history. Going by the list of Sumerian kings from history, Dumuzid is believed to have been the 5th antediluvian king of a Sumerian city named Bad Tibera, known as the Fortress of Smiths, and now located in southern Iraq. Yet he was also believed to be an early king of the ancient city of Uruk, also found in what is now modern-day Iraq. Under this guise as a king, he appears to be merely a ruler of his people, though he is also associated with the goddess Inanna as one of her consorts. Additionally, Dumuzid was also believed to have been a provider of milk, likely in his stint as the god of shepherds. This is notable, given that milk was considered to be something of a seasonal luxury in Mesopotamia, due to the fact that it was not easy to store and preserve milk without it going off. Dumuzid was also believed to be an agricultural deity, much like Enlil or Ninhursag, for he was said to be occupied with the growing and maintaining of crops and plants. With this idea, Dumuzid was considered to be a friend of humanity, blessing them with trees, flowers, plants, and crops, as well as being seen as their maintainer, protecting them from supernatural evils, and guarding them from ruin. Whilst he was never specifically prayed to, those who did were likely to request more resources, such as grain and cattle, given his dominion over them, or perhaps an extended period or earlier emergence of springtime. It was during springtime that Dumuzid would undertake his duties, for it is during the spring that the land was abundant and most fertile. Now, the Mesopotamians weren't necessarily as well versed in the science of botany as we are today, and in a time where man was at the mercy of nature and her harsh elements, they found comfort in embracing fantasy and myth in order to explain why their crops prospered and why they failed. So by this logic, if springtime proved to be the most fertile time for crops and plants, then Dumuzid was believed to have been amongst them, and his careful hand ensured successful production. But alternatively, if summer brought dry and barren land, then Dumuzid was believed to have been absent and had not only deserted humanity but also forsaken his crops and plants. Rather than believe that Dumuzid could be as fickle as the seasons, it was far more noble for the Mesopotamians to view Dumuzid as having died. So every summer, the people across Sumer would mourn his death with great expression. In fact, this appears to have been one of the more notable ways in which he was worshipped, perhaps one of the more unique methods of paying tribute to one's deity. In some regions of Sumer, the period of mourning would last an entire month, where residents would openly weep for the death of their god, and perhaps on a more crucial level, weep for the lack of fertile ground for which to work with. Such a tradition was eventually adopted by the Babylonians, where the process would be named Tammuz, the same name that the god would become to be more recognized by. The cult of this Tammuz consisted of mostly women, and when we speak of weeping on the streets, it was believed to have mostly been women. But for the weeping locals, their grief would only be temporary, for in the autumn seasons, when the devastating dry season was over, the land became fertile again, and with this, Dumuzid had returned from the dead. For the people of Sumer, this became the status quo, the cycle of life, if you will, with Dumuzid paying the ultimate price every year, but always returning to bring plants and crops. With this, Dumuzid was a welcome deity, and his continuous return was a cause for celebration and joy. To the ancients, Dumuzid, despite his death, was a stable and reliable god, who although left the land barren, always returned to see it lush. Indeed, with this idea of Dumuzid, he was considered to be a more favourable and generous deity, and though he does die, his death is usually ambiguous, and doesn't suggest suffering. But when we consider the poems and other narratives involving Dumuzid and his many deaths, we understand that Dumuzid was far from a selfless being, and that his deaths were certainly not always peaceful, and certainly not without a darker twist. One of the most famous accounts of Dumuzid's death begins on an old Sumerian tablet known as the Courtship of Inanna and Dumuzid. Whilst his death is not detailed here in this story, his courtship of Inanna, she who would become his wife, certainly sows the seed of such a misendeavour. The story begins with Inanna speaking with her brother Utu, who determines that it is high time she took a husband. Dumuzid, considered here to be a shepherd, presents himself as a candidate, though not without the contest of a farmer named Enkimdu. Interestingly, at first sight, Inanna prefers Enkimdu, but with some mutterings of her brother, Inanna is led to believe that Dumuzid would make for a better husband. Both shepherd and farmer argue for Inanna's hand in marriage, but after some consideration, Inanna chooses Dumuzid. Fast forward to the epic poem known as Inanna's Descent into the Underworld, where Inanna is exiled to the underworld for her conceit. We see not only a less virtuous side of Dumuzid, but also come to understand the nature of his marriage. Inanna, after having been exiled, is able to escape the clutches of the underworld. However, a horde of demons are sent after her, and they follow her up out of the dark depths and onto the surface. These demons, under the command of Inanna's sister, Ereshkigal, who was the governess of the underworld, decree that if Inanna won't return to the underworld, then someone else will have to take her place. The demons take their pick from various characters who are loyal to Inanna, but because of their devotion and their heartfelt mourning of her absence, Inanna vouches for them and stops the demons from taking them. But when the demons come upon Dumuzid, they find him seated in Inanna's throne, having the time of his life no less. He is described as being entertained by several slave girls, roaring with laughter and drinking to his heart's content, evidently unfazed and unbothered that his wife has been exiled at all. Now you might argue that this was Dumuzid's way of processing his loss, and that his debaucherous antics were a unique way of dealing with the grief of losing his wife. But Inanna doesn't give him the chance to explain, and instead nominates him as the person who should take her place. The demons were all but happy to oblige, and without any hesitation, they pluck Dumuzid from his wife's throne and carry him off to the underworld, effectively marking his death. The narrative here does more than just cover the descent and return of Inanna, but it also offers a cause of death, albeit an insidious one, for Dumuzid. Whilst he was believed to have simply expired in the summer months, this narrative allows for a more concrete reason as to why he perished. Though you might say that this only covers one of his deaths, and you'd be right for thinking so, but there also exist other variations that might cover some of his other demises. For example, in the Sumerian poem The Dream of Dumuzid, the demons who come for Dumuzid end up finding his sister Geshtinana instead, and take her to the underworld. Whilst he has the opportunity to protect his sister, he chooses to hide instead. The demons torture Geshtinana in the hopes of learning where Dumuzid is, but despite their best efforts, she does not submit the information. The demons eventually claw the information out of an unnamed friend of Dumuzid, which leads them to capturing Dumuzid and carrying him off to the underworld. So we see here that Dumuzid once again succumbs to an ill fate, though you might argue that in both these instances, his death is warranted. First, he doesn't mourn for his wife, which sees him suffer a mortal punishment at her own hand. But secondly, he doesn't stand up for his sister, and instead proves to be cowardly by allowing her to be tortured in exchange for his own freedom. In both cases, you might argue that Dumuzid deserved his demise, as opposed to being necessary, so as to coincide with the changing of seasons. It might also be argued that the Sumerians believed that Dumuzid had to die, so that the seasons could change from spring to summer. So in order to rationalize his death, they gave him a narrative that was easier to digest, and in some sense was justifiable. In an additional part of this narrative, Utu, the sun god, turns Dumuzid into a gazelle so that he might escape the demons, but in the end, the demons catch up to him, and once again, drag him down into the underworld. Several other accounts of Dumuzid's death are also recorded on various ancient tablets. In a damaged text known as Inanna and Bilulu, Dumuzid is believed to have been murdered by a female bandit named Bilulu. Due to the text being mostly unintelligible, there are many scholarly theories as to what the text means and how exactly Dumuzid's death occurs. Though the only thing that's certain, however, is that Inanna is able to achieve her revenge by transforming Bilulu into a water skin, so that she is forced to be the instrument that serves as libation during Dumuzid's funeral. In yet another text known as The Most Bitter Cry, we see Dumuzid being chased by several demons, and that as he is running, he falls into a river, where he either drowns or is dragged down into the underworld. As we can see, the death of Dumuzid seems to have been inevitable, no matter how much he tried to avoid it. Not even Geshtinana or Utu could protect Dumuzid from expiring, much as we cannot prevent the season of spring from fading. But the ancients were likely not keen on creating a new death for Dumuzid every single year, so luckily, a creative approach was taken in sequelizing the narrative that not only redeemed Dumuzid, but also provided a continuous reason as to why spring had to end. This came about from a Sumerian poem, The Return of Dumuzid, where Geshtinana laments over the death of her brother, even though he did leave her to be tortured. She's also joined by Inanna, who appears to also mourn for her husband, and arguably has either forgiven him or dearly misses him. Together, they journey to find Dumuzid in the underworld, and decide that their ill-fated relative is to be offered some peace. It is then decreed that Dumuzid will spend half of the year with his sister Geshtinana in the underworld, and the other half of the year in heaven with Inanna. With this, Dumuzid is still punished for his previous malfeasances, but he is also offered respite by getting to be with his sister, albeit in hell, and getting to visit his wife in the heavens. With this narrative, it can be argued that Dumuzid died every year when spring came to an end, where he was returned to the underworld to be with his sister. But come autumn, he was risen again to be with his wife, and brought with him the blessings that were expected of an agricultural god. The only loser here appears to be Geshtinana, who, despite having done nothing wrong and having been previously tortured by the demons, now has to live in the underworld to provide her brother company. Dumuzid's powers are often up for some questioning. We know he doesn't possess considerable strength or mastery over magic, for if he did, he probably would have fared better against the demons which came to routinely capture him. Despite being a deity, it's reasonable to believe that he didn't possess any distinct power at all, at least not outside of his realm of responsibility. In one interpretation, he was also referred to as my Damu, which meant my son, and this name was used to personify him as the power which caused sap to rise in trees. But beyond his usual dominion over fertile land in the spring, Dumuzid doesn't have much going for him, though you might argue that this influence was sufficient enough power, given that he kept humanity alive in the spring. It's also true that unlike other Mesopotamian gods, Dumuzid certainly had some staying power, given that worship of him was said to have continued well into the 10th and 11th centuries of the Common Era. This would be well after the decline of the Mesopotamian religions during the 5th century, where the Assyrians converted to Christianity. Speaking of Christianity, it's interesting that despite not being one of the more popular deities, Dumuzid or Tammuz earns a mention in the Bible. In chapter 8 of Ezekiel's account, Ezekiel is shown by his god the women who mourn Tammuz outside the second temple. We are told, "Then God brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord, and I saw women sitting there, mourning the god Tammuz." Ezekiel's god refers to these worshippers and their god as abominations, and it's likely that they were included in this account by the original authors to show believers that God disapproved of idolatry. But with the specific mention of women mourning Tammuz, it's likely that the authors were referencing Tammuz's several deaths, and that at this time it was likely summer, a time where Tammuz died and his worshippers mourned him. But let me know what your thoughts are on today's episode of Mesopotamian Mythology Explained. As always, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.